Bismillah, bir ben bana bir benden, ben benim bir ben bana.
Welcome to the Sufi Heart podcast with Omid Safi, featuring teachings and stories from the wisdom of the Islamic tradition. Omid invites you to a meditation on the transformative power of love and recalling the necessity of healing our own hearts through healing the world. If you'd like to support Omid's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Omid.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Sufi Heart podcast. Recently, I had a wonderful conversation with my friend Josh over at the Emerald podcast. And if you're not familiar with him, I would highly encourage you to go to the mythicbody.com and check out the Emerald podcast. You can also catch it in all the usual places. And I find Josh to be one of the most insightful voices on contemporary spirituality. And the Emerald is a really rich and imaginative meditation on our current state. So I had a long conversation with the Emerald on an episode that they called on singing to the beloved in times of crisis. And I thought that the whole conversation that we shared was actually so rich that I wanted to make that available to you here in the Sufi Heart. So give it a listen. And if you like what you hear, feel free to check out some more of our offerings at illuminatedcourses.com. We do have some retreats coming up. April in Morocco, June in Turkey, and Mecca and Medina in December. And with that, I welcome you to this month's episode. Thank you for joining us.
So, what in your view is the necessity of seeing the divine as beloved?
Yeah. There's a wonderful saying of the Prophet Muhammad in which he talks about God asking us to think well, to imagine well. You could even translate it as suspect well of God. And it says at one point, I am with my devotees as they suspect me to be. I am with my servants, devotees, as they have imagined me to be. So I think people's God language, their God concept, may not tell us a lot about God, but it does tell us a lot about them. And is that conception of God a wrathful, punishing judge and a king? Or is it also a friend? Is it a lover? Is it a beloved? And I think ideally, one doesn't want to have a keeper of the stars who's a teddy bear, right? There has to be an element of majesty and transcendence. But a God who's only transcendent, who's only royal, is out of balance, is out of whack. And every mystic in Islam, worth his or her salt, always talks about how the absolute majesty of God and the complete incomprehensible intimacy with God are always in balance with one another, and that one without the other is missing something. So, you've had a 1,000-year tradition that says things like, this is a famous Sufi, Abu Nu'aym Esfahani. He says, oh God, when I'm in public, I call you my Lord. But in solitude, I call you my beloved. And that ability to shift registers, to preserve the awesomeness of God and supplement it with this language of love, which is relational. And, the thing about every great love story, and the Islamic tradition is filled with them, is that at some point in the story, there's a turn, and the one who was the lover now gets to experience being the beloved. The one who was sought after now has to be the one to chase after. Otherwise, it's just a one-way dysfunctional relationship. And that moment of transformation where, I think there was a folk singer from the 60s, I've seen love from both sides now. That's what the spiritual path is, that it happens again and again and again. It's not even a one-time turn. It's a perpetual turn. And there's a very luminous sage, Bayezid, that when he gets to be a little older than I am now, 60-something, he says at one point, my Lord, I have loved you for all 60 years of my life. And he hears the voice of God, who says to him, my friend, I have loved you since before there was a thing called time. And I think that's really the crux of the mystical tradition in Islam. It's the almost unfathomable pleasure that the one that we love has loved us first, and the one that we seek has been seeking us first. And it's a love that's also sensual. It's a love that you could use the word erotic in explaining it. The body is also a participant in it. And, one has to be a little wise about these things, because, of course, nowadays, everything that is bodily and sensual is exploited, and it's commodified and commercialized. But if the possibility of the sensual and the spiritual being the two wings with which we soar is still preserved, in any great love affair, in every great lovemaking, there's always that moment where you lose track of where your body ends and the beloved's body begins. And there's not even anymore a notion of who's the lover and who's the beloved. There's only the moment, and there's only pure absolute pleasure and bliss. And that's in some ways what the mystics are trying to get to. They're trying to get to that place where the boundary between you and I, lover and beloved, human and divine, becomes very blurred, very fuzzy. And Rumi has a wonderful, wonderful poem. It's always been one of my favorites. In fact, my wife and I used it in our wedding vows. You and I should live as if you and I never heard of a you and an I. And the thing that's so powerful about this kind of poetry, this kind of teaching, is, of course, that it works for a human lover and beloved, right? We're going to live as if we never heard of a you and I. We're going to stop this nonsensical accounting practice of I did the dishes and you took out the trash and why this and why that. And it also works in terms of human and divine. What if the relationship between us and the divine beloved is not some accounting firm? It's not some transactional relationship to get into a higher real state called heaven. So I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, one of the things that I find profound about the visions of lover and beloved is that there's this sense of exactly what you're talking about, of the possibility of the somatic experience of merging and the union that the beloved promises. But there's also this like frank recognition in many of these traditions of the fact that that's not the perpetual state, and that the dance of lover and beloved is also a dance of separation. And this I find, so key because if it were just a vision that, we melt blissfully into the body of the beloved, it wouldn't actually be encapsulating, the dynamics of our relationship with the sacred and with the divine, which fluctuate. And on one given day, we might feel a million miles away from the beloved, and the good devotional poets will say, beloved, I feel a million miles away from you. And then the next minute you're right here. And I think that the recognition of this pulse has a lot to offer us, so that it's not a vision of the divine is perpetually, like you're saying, grand and far away, nor is it a vision of, the divine is always right here and always in the mundane details. And, and I think these days, people maybe are prone to one or the other, like either there are religions of the transcendent God,
right,
or there's like, no, we've been worshiping the transcendent God for too long and we have to bring it all right back here, and it's all got to be right here. And people are getting maybe a little bit lost in the woods of right here. And so I like this aspect of the beloved traditions that view the kind of natural pulse between the faraway divine and the up close divine, and the frustration when it's far away, and all of it, really. How do you see this?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, I had a wonderful experience a few years ago. I take people on these retreats and, sacred journeys, pilgrimages to Turkey and Morocco and Mecca and elsewhere. And some years ago, we had a particularly powerful group experience on a journey to Turkey. And we studied Rumi's tradition and this whole ecstatic love, radical love tradition. And the last day of the program, we met with this female Sufi in Istanbul. And she's a living sage. Like she's there and she's here and all of that. And, we got to ask her lots of questions. And my wife asked the question of, how do we hang on to this? We've had 10 of the most powerful, amazing days of our life, one spiritual highlight after another. How do we take this home? How do we stay in this state? And I was really interested, and I was curious also as someone who teaches this stuff. I was like, oh, I wonder what story is she going to tell them, or what practice is she going to give them to be able to hang on to this? And instead, what she said was completely counterintuitive. And she said, you can't, and you won't, and you shouldn't even try, which was not really what I think the group was expecting. And so they sort of did a double take. And she turned to my wife and she said, if I understand things right, you're a gardener, right? And my wife is a gardener and she's a daughter of farmers. And she said, yeah. And so the sage said to her, the Sufi woman, in the spring, trees have blossoms. And in the summertime, sometimes those blossoms turn to fruit. And they're very sweet and delicious. And yet trees cannot always blossom. And they cannot always give fruit. And if they did, they would burn out. And there comes a time in the autumn where they have to let go of their leaves. And in the winter, they appear to be dead. They're not dead. The life force of the tree retreats down to its roots, and it has time for repose and to rejuvenate. And then in the spring, it reemerges again as the blossoms and as the fruit and as the leaves falling. And she said, we're just like this. Nature is a living saint because it has mastered the wisdom of seasons and cycles. And we're like this too. The heart contracts before it can expand. The breath has to come out, all the way out. You push out every last breath, and then the air comes rushing in. And our spiritual life is like this too. It cannot just be one absolute ecstatic experience of union and orgasmic oneness with all after another. We would burn out. Or worse, we could become spiritual junkies. A friend of mine calls this, the endless quest for spiritual candy. And the fact of the matter is that any real spiritual path also involves grunt work and going into those silent spaces where your own spiritual experiences might feel like a nostalgia, and you wonder if they're ever going to come again. And, by the grace of God, they do. But it's the alternation of the day and the night and the seasons and the breath and the heartbeat, which is really the map for our state. And really great relationships, even at the human level, sometimes have that too. There's a constancy of friendship and love and respect. But then, you can also look back at the rhythm of your own human romance. And you notice that, sometimes it has its own seasons as well.
Beautiful. I'm interested, like, these days, I think there is a lot of, in times of crisis and times of upheaval, there's been a lot of attention placed in progressive circles. There's a lot of attention placed on like when people are bypassing, like when people are maybe just wanting that transcendent phase of the spiritual experience. And I think that, calling that out, calling attention to that is very important, reminding us of finding it in the details. But then I also find, especially when there's a lack of grounding in spiritual practice, that there's a lot of people becoming, I would say, kind of lost in the details and lost in the immediate. And for replenishment, and not just for replenishment, but really for for many reasons. I think it's important that people not forget also that greater vision, the vision of the greater cycles that we're part of. Could you speak a little bit about how, you see both aspects of this pulse being necessary?
Yeah. In Islam, which is just a tradition that I know a little bit more intimately, there are these relationships with God, which are sometimes called the divine names or the divine qualities, and they're familiar to people of many faith traditions. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the first and the last. That's one set of the pair. I am the manifest and the inward. I am the one who gives life, and I'm the one who receives you back at the end of your existence. And so, this notion of it's not really a binary, it's the fact that everything is part of that all-inclusive aspect of being not just with the divine, but in the divine. It's the fish in the ocean that probably doesn't have a word for the ocean. And then every now and then, you come across one of these, what you would think of would be a syzygy or a dyad, and you realize that one of them is not used as a name of God. And so, as you said, of course, we want to be on guard against either the totally transcendent, unknowable God. I mean, who wants that? And also, this notion of a God who is so imminent, but that's really because we cannot conceive of grandeur. We cannot even conceive of really something beyond this sensory realm. So I think that tension is really helpful. And in Islam, the way that it's sometimes articulated is one of the divine names is Al-Qarib, which means the near. The near. But Al-Ba'id, which is the distant, is not a divine name. Right? So, yeah, we have to somehow balance transcendence and imminence. But there is no distantness from God, because where would we go? Where would we go outside of that ocean? And so they try to speak about this not in terms of ontology and being, but in terms of experience. And so many of the great poets, they say things like, what a grand mystery this is, that you are so close to me and I feel so far from you. It's not about where God is. It's about where we feel like we are. And some of our greatest sages and poets, Rumi being the best example, they love to play with this metaphor. There's a beautiful story of Rabia, the famous female mystic. She's walking by one day and she hears a preacher preaching, and he's essentially repeating the Gospels. Ask and it shall be granted unto you. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. And so she hears this and she pokes her head into the church or mosque or temple, whatever it is. And she goes, what did you say? The preacher is very annoyed that this woman has interrupted, his majestic sermon. And so he says, woman, I said, knock and it shall be opened unto you. And Rabia says, fool, from where I am, the door has never been closed. And this notion that, even our experience of having to open the door to God, that says more about us and our disenchanted existence than it says anything about God. Rumi grows up with this story. And of course, these sages are not content to just pass on what has come down to them. They have to make their own contribution. Religion is not inheritance. It's also lived into. And so Rumi comes up with his own quatrain, and he says, my friend, you have spent your entire life knocking and knocking and knocking at the door of God. Sweetheart, you're knocking from the inside. You're already in divine presence, and you're knocking at the door, being like, why does this not open? You're home. You're home. And so part of the spiritual experience of God as the beloved is to actually go on a journey to realize that we've been home all along. And so many mystic and mythic paths, they have this. The hero has to go on a quest to find out who he or she has been all along, or that the treasure is always at home. But it's the journey that is the transformation, not so much the destination.
Beautiful. And I think that's interesting because Rumi also has that poem, I believe, where he's speaking about, how we go around seeking the beloved and looking for the beloved over here. And all the while the beloved was right here.
That's right.
I think to me, it shows like you're saying, when we're in that state of perceived longing or lack, that too is sacred. And I think that, in our, especially in modern culture, which is in many ways built around, you could call it the perpetuation of a discomfort around lack. Any want is supposed to be filled. Any longing is supposed to be met. And if you haven't met it, then you better go out and, whatever it is, buy that brand name shoe or, and the idea that when a human being is in the state of longing for the divine, that too is divine. To me, this has implications for how we are with longing and with lack. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's something about that longing, which is so necessary for us to set out on a spiritual path. The Sufis didn't usually use the word Sufi. They used all kinds of other terms, and one of the they love terms like seeker, or even a lover. In Rumi's circle, when you would want to begin your spiritual journey, if you're very dedicated, you would be called a lover. And I think there's something about that notion of thirst. He's got this beautiful poem says, "Don't seek water, seek thirst." Because it's the thirst that will lead you to the water of life. And it's the thirst that will let you realize, as he says in this beautiful poem, you're already standing knee deep in the water of life with parched lips dying of thirst. So it's like the answer is right here. The beloved is right here, but we won't realize that until we experience that seeking, that thirst, that longing, that need even.
And we have these moments of consummation where, like you're saying, we feel that ecstatic union.
Yeah.
And then, we either want to make it stay, or we then feel that when we're not in those moments of consummation, that the divine has somehow gotten farther away. And really, that pulse, you could say, is the divine dance itself. That pulse that, leads us to seek those moments of longing. And then when those moments of longing are consummated, and we return to our normal everyday state and we long again, that longing itself is in a way like the divine impulse, like the magnet of the divine calling.
Yeah, exactly. And the Sufis love to tell these kind of, wonderful stories, which, the stories themselves are the message. They're not a suitcase for spiritual teaching. They imagined the day of reckoning, their resurrection to come, and everybody's gathered, and God comes and says, "Who here wishes to have every sensory pleasure in the world?" And 90% of people raise their hand, and it is yours. You may leave. And then, "Who here wishes to be spared any pain and any suffering? Never again sickness or aging, certainly no torment of hellfire." 90% of those raise their hand and they leave. And "Who here wishes to attain to my loftiest paradise, a luminous garden that no eye has ever seen and no word has ever described?" 90% of those left raise their hand. And, there's a couple of Sufis left say, "Well, we looked around and there was just a handful of us left." And this time the voice of God comes thundering at them. "I gave you every sensory pleasure. You chose it not. I gave you a chance to be free from pain and suffering and torment. You chose it not. I even offered you the garden. You chose it not. What are you here for?" And, the Sufis say, we lowered our heads and said, "We didn't come for sensation. We didn't come for the garden. We didn't come to avoid pain. We came for you." And then and only then do they hear the voice of God come into them saying, "Well, in that case, I am yours." That's what they're in for. That's what they're seeking. But there has to be that element of experiencing and being willing to put it aside. Being granted powerful spiritual visions and saying, "I didn't come for the candy." And for many of the Sufis, it's only when you're willing to put aside the fruits of the path that you can actually advance. Otherwise, it's so easy to become distracted. And at the end of the day, there's one beloved, and this whole creation is the beloved's dance with himself, with herself. And
yeah, it's interesting, that distinction between, especially for me, the distinction between seeing the glories and the marvels of the garden, and the difference between that and we came for you. We came for you, and how you show up, and the immediacy of your presence, and it's beautiful.
It is. There's I love how in our age, of course, we have our own mythology, and I think about the original Star Wars as being a great example of that. And, there's that scene where Obi-Wan is in one of these space riding things, and the guards are looking for Jedis, and he goes, "These are not the ones you're looking for." And he sort of does this thing with his hand to put it aside. That's exactly how Sufis talk about it. when they're having their ascension experience to God, they go through level by level through heaven. And at every level of heaven, they see angels and fairies and palaces of jewels and lights. And the only ones who get to advance are the ones who sort of can do the Jedi thing and go, this is not what we came for. Only then can they move on. And love is such a powerful aphrodisiac. And I think at a human realm, a lot of us, myself included, can think about earlier parts of our life where you're more addicted to the endorphins of being in love with someone than the actual work of building a good relationship. And the spiritual path mirrors that in some ways. So I think that's where the lessons of separation and union at an experiential level offers us a lot.
Yeah. Before we move on I have some questions about the connection to the beloved in this day and age. But before we move on to that, I'm wondering, just linguistically, if there are terms for the beloved in Persian or Arabic that have some beauties for us to explore, what term Rumi often used. And
They use a number of terms. Arabic and Persian languages are so rich when it comes to love and eroticism and sensuality. So, there's the word Habib, which is the beloved. And it's used for God, and then it's also used for the prophet because he is God's own beloved. And in fact, if you just want to address your friend, oftentimes, Habibi, my beloved. According to some Sufis, the word Habib comes from the word for bubbles. It's a funny expression. It's almost like, I see you and I'm very fond of you. And so it's almost like this bubble of love that starts forming inside of me. And if you ever watch a kettle and see how bubbles come together and they get agitated until they get hotter and hotter, and then they rise through the water, get to the surface and pop. And they say this is what happens to each one of us when we experience the bubble of love forming until the heart cannot contain it anymore, and it rises to the surface and it pops as a kind glance or a loving word, or maybe a touch on the shoulder. And then to think of ourselves as being God's love bubble. That creation is that bubble that forms, if you would, inside of God until it couldn't be contained anymore, and it had to pop as creation. To think of yourself as a love bubble is much more pleasant to me than, being cast out in some exile. And then the word dost, which means friend. And that's one of Rumi's favorite ways of addressing God, the friend. When the Habib, in this case, the Prophet Muhammad, was taking his last breath, his last earthly word was the highest friend. The highest friend is, he was given a choice of whether to prolong his earthly life. And he said, no, I choose the highest friend, Ar-Rafiq al-Ala. And to think of God as a friend also. That's a beautiful concept.
Yeah, what you were saying about the bubbling forth reminded me of, I believe it was in Corban's work around Ibn al-Arabi when he speaks about the secret treasure that longed to be known.
Right. Mm. Right. And, it also changes the way we see each other. Rumi again says, whenever you see a ruin, suspect a treasure. And sometimes when we look at each other, and we look at the hardships that people have gone through, and God was a hidden treasure, and human beings can also be a hidden treasure. And sometimes the treasures of our life are actually directly related to the hardships we have endured.
Speaking of hardships, we live in interesting times, as we were talking about before the conversation started. And how do you see like the necessity in these times for this lover-beloved relationship? And, you know, like what you just said, for example, about seeing the hidden treasure amidst a ruin. I think that people have, are cultivating a capacity to do that with people who they mostly get along with. But we live in times of such polarization, and really, as I'm sure many people who did not want the outcome of this past election to be exactly what it was, but who also I've been deeply critical of the Democratic Party for years and its kind of failure to galvanize and this type of thing.
Right.
I see the need for what you could call an activism that goes beyond just trying to convince people of something, that goes beyond just like, here's my talking points and you better accept them. And perhaps is much more aligned to, creating space where we can see the hidden treasures amidst the ruins of each other. And I'm interested how you see vision, the beloved vision in times like this and what we are called to do.
Yeah, we do live in strange times, that's for sure. And at times we live in absurd times where words don't seem to mean what they should mean. We heard lots of God talk recently at the inauguration, and at the same time, horrible statements about refugees and immigrants. And it's as if that same God has never had anything to say about refugees. In almost any tradition, there's also Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Be kind to the stranger, for you yourselves were once strangers. So I think part of what we're called to do is to re-enchant the world, suffuse it with a genuine, vibrant, robust spirit so that love actually means love and justice actually means justice. And God bears some resemblance to the God of love and the God of justice, instead of just simply being God being the hammer by which I can smash the most vulnerable of people. These days I'm thinking a lot about some of the statements of the Prophet Muhammad, and one of them is, in the beginning, faith, and he's talking about Islam specifically, began strange or as a stranger, and it will someday return strange or as a stranger. I think that's true for a lot of us. There's a strange kind of Judaism these days, which bears no resemblance to the faith of Moses and the concern for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the needy. There's a strange kind of Christianity, which seems to bear very little resemblance to the faith of Jesus of Nazareth. There's a strange kind of Islam, which bears very little resemblance to the love and mercy and justice of what Muhammad shared with us. religion is showing up in a very strange form. But maybe, if we take seriously that mission, that hope is also a divine calling and a choice. And it's not just willy-nilly optimism. Everything's going to be all right. It's not that, but it's that willful choice in the midst of the dark night of the soul. Religion will someday return as a stranger. And in a sea of racism and nationalism and misogyny and violence and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, maybe we will yet again live to see a faith that's about love of the neighbor and love of the stranger and love of the self and love of trees and olive trees and the birds as emanating from the same one source. And that would be a very counterculture notion these days. And it wouldn't come from the highest corridors of power. But may we have eyes and ears and hearts to recognize it. And maybe be parts of helping to resurrect it.
Yeah, beautiful. And I mean, to me, I feel that it will rise with, a world that becomes basically untenable because when the communication polarizations reach such a point of just untenability, where you step into the internet and you're being dragged into 100, like that, it won't be tenable to try and live in this kind of, you could say, abstracted ideology of separation. It will only be tenable to live in a place of, well, I just have to kind of put this to the side a little bit and see how my neighbor's doing.
Right.
That's kind of what I see might provoke some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the neighbor, both our immediate neighbor, literally the person that our house or gardens may be touching, but also our global neighbor. And younger generations these days, they get it that with global warming, what happens in China doesn't stay in China, and it will change California, and it will change Bangladesh, and that really we're all in this together. And that, the old folly of all of us being on a small boat, but, some foolish elite thinking that they can poke holes on the other end of the boat and that's going to somehow raise them up, that this is a very short-sighted solution, and eventually they're all going to go under.
One of the things you just said was interesting in the heart Christian message of the beloved is to be found through the other, right? The beloved is to be found through the neighbor. Yeah. The divine is to be found through the neighbor, through the other. And you have, obviously, with the rise of nationalism and, anti-immigration law and this type of thing, you have a rejection of that view. But then, the reaction to that sometimes is like kind of a, well, don't you see, the beloved has to be found through the neighbor, and that becomes its own way of not finding that beloved space of the treasure amidst the ruins. And I think this is probably one of the hardest parts, I'd say, of like being a progressive, for example, is that you lovingly see, the problem.
Yeah.
There's a great diagnosis of the problem, but to be able to diagnose the problem and still walk lovingly, has been a challenge. Has been a challenge for years. And how does one do that?
Well, shouting and yelling on social media is probably not it. And,
you heard it here first, folks.
and how I would love to remind myself first and foremost of that. Yeah, I mean, somehow we have to remember that, the ends that we seek have to be obtained through means that are consistent with it. And that it's very hard for us to get to that destination of a beloved human community if our very modality of interaction is not loving. And being loving doesn't mean abandoning being firm when needed. The truth does have to be spoken. And, I'm very fond of people who remind us to speak the truth, even if your voice is shaking, particularly at a time where, the wrong is forever on the throne and truth is forever on the scaffold. But there's something about a space for gentleness and kindness. And that takes a special kind of strength these days to not lose our own highest divine calling in an age of bombast.
And I think a deep recognition of, this, what you could call endless flow of togetherness and separation and divide. And, when I stand, I mean, obviously it depends who's standing in front of me, but the vast majority of people, even if they see things a little different from me politically, when they stand right before me, is it their fault? Are they the problem? Are they really the cause of it?
Yeah.
And like when I've seen transformation happen in hearts, a lot of it has to do with time and space where, I'm not immediately trying to convince or convert or, but how do you build a movement around that? It's hard to. It's hard to.
Yeah. And in some ways, the local is so important here, because I think for so many of us who have platforms or access to wonderful podcasts like yours, it's very easy to find your people scattered around and they see eye to eye more or less with you. But how many of us actually know the person who lives 3 doors down from us? And how many of us know the challenges and hardships that they're going through? I think there's a lot of work to be done for keeping this global outlook, but also not losing sight of the very local, because that's where a lot of the most beautiful transformations can and do happen.
For some friends of mine who just went through the flooding in Asheville, North Carolina, which isn't too far away from where you are.
3 hours, yeah.
They remarked on how in the days after the flooding, before it all became like politicized and the conspiracy theories started, but in the days after the flooding, it was nonpartisan, non-denominational. It was neighbor helping neighbor.
Yeah.
And this is how it tends to be. And I've seen this. And, sometimes it feels to me that, like, I'd say, like, if the extent of our activism is to, to be deeply agitated about things that are fairly far away geographically, and to have there be no translation into, well, this translates into how I am with my neighbor.
Right.
And I'm actually not, other than the agitation, I'm actually not doing much for that far away cause either. I think a lot of time that passes as activism these days. Like, activism is my outrage over the global. But it has to have, and again, I feel the pulse of the beloved in this. There has to be an element of it that is me and you sitting down and breaking bread together.
Right. And isn't that, that beautiful metaphor of breaking bread? Isn't there something about eating together? I mean, there's a grace to sharing a meal. And I sometimes think about, people who see themselves as being quite liberal. And then you think about who are the folks that they have invited to their home. Especially if you start thinking about, yes, of course, different ethnicities and races, but also in terms of social classes. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I was thinking of, knowingly and willingly, how many Trump supporters have I had over to my house for dinner? Some of that is self-preservation, and some of that is sanity, and being mindful of being a person of a limited amount of patience these days. But I wonder where that fine line is between the bubbles that many of us exist in and perhaps need to exist in at this particular moment. And then, that willingness to be changed and be surprised by the humanity of people with whom we might have some important differences.
My experience with what you're talking about is that when I've been in those beloved meal spaces with people who see things very differently than I do, that and obviously there are going to be exceptions. There are going to be people who you don't want to invite to your house over for dinner, absolutely. Right? But that they're afraid of pretty much the exact same thing I'm afraid of. Yeah. They have felt judged. They have felt like they're ridiculed. They have felt like, that there's no openness for them to, carry on their particular cultural ways, not all of which are, horrendously vile racism and this type of thing. Yeah. And that space, I mean, I honestly don't see a way forward if we can't find those spaces together.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in a world of, because the other option, which has always historically been an option, is like, no, you get enough people on your side with your viewpoint and you get enough guns or enough votes and you take the place out. Well, what do you do with the 50% of the population then that doesn't quite see it like that?
And they're still there. And they're still there. And even if you choose to see them as people who have toxic views, that toxicity is still there. And so really the goal is not somehow to wall it off from you, even if it is toxic. And even if one were to grant that it's toxic, it's to heal it.
Yeah, it's to find a way for that toxicity to mend.
Yeah.
And, the view, like when people are willing to look at the toxicity of others and not willing to look at their own. And again, there are degrees. I mean, like there are obviously deeply toxic subcultural groups at play in the United States right now. But I've encountered a lot of what I would call toxicity in progressive discourse. And if there's not even the slightest willingness to say, oh, wow, yeah, we can be pretty toxic too.
Absolutely. One of the funny experiences that I've had, I work and teach at a university, and from time to time, we want to have pretty radical speaker come and say lots of very progressive things that are going to get people all shook up. And the university solution usually is, let's sell tickets to dissuade the community from showing up. And I have to tell them, the most vile, racist, hateful things that have ever been said to me have come from people who have PhDs. It comes from people who work in this very university. It's not the town people. It's not the community people. It's other professors who can at times be like really racist, hateful, obnoxious people. So, you know, I think sometimes we ourselves are the thing that we fear. And that's not to wash away or dismiss or belittle structural, institutional injustices that are built in, because of course those are also real. But I think we can become a little too dogmatic in the way that we go about that conversation.
And this is part of, I feel, and this is just a personal opinion, but I feel that part of the reason that, and I don't know how, politically specific you want to get, but I feel like the failure to galvanize in this particular election had a lot to do with what I would call spirit and connection to spirit, and a willingness to talk of matters of spirit, and a willingness or an ability to even recognize what spirit is and what moves people. And
Absolutely.
like a missing call to the beloved, really.
Yeah.
Like, what is this existence about and why am I here? And it's not enough maybe at this point to just keep talking about like, oh, it's basically fine and we just have to kind of march on and, in our neoliberal way and this kind of thing that like, and, even just like trust the experts, trust the science, and we'll all figure it out when it comes. It's like people are longing for something much deeper than that. And, I don't agree with how the other party kind of co-ops spirit for their perspective. But, there is like a mystery there and a movement there that just, voters tend to go where things are moving.
Yeah.
And that life, that spirit, that call to deep reassessments of what the beloved is, I think, for me anyway, I felt missing.
I agree. And, these days especially, I don't, certainly not a Republican, but I also don't in any way identify with the Democratic Party. And I think part of it is, on the Republican side, you see this very unfortunate marriage of the name of religion to a kind of racist capitalist nationalism. And on the Democratic side, for lack of a better term, it's a kind of corporate centrism, which is devoid of the spirit. And once every 4 years, the Hillary Clinton types show up in a black church and put on a black accent. And they think that that's somehow going to make us think that God is moving through the Democratic Party. No, I'm sorry. God has a lot to do with your stance on war. And God has a lot to do with how you treat immigrants. And God has a lot to do with taxation and the most vulnerable. And God is about love and the beloved community. And the thing that people forget is that North America is not Europe. And North America is a profoundly religious society. And there are many people all over the political spectrum who want to see the sacred and the political have a cozy relationship. And if the ones who want to build a just society don't understand that, then it's going to be the people on the other side who will co-opt it. And they have.
I could not agree with you more. I think that the vacuum of spirit is a big part of the mess that we're in.
Absolutely.
You know, and even just a simple understanding of, you know, spirit as like the refreshing breath of life that moves through discourse. I mean, people talked about, you know, oh, Trump was willing to go on those 3.5 hour long podcast interviews and Kamala wasn't. And you can talk about that in terms of its, you know, PR significance and this kind of thing. But what it gets at is like, you know, the unwillingness to go off script, the unwillingness to really connect to what you could call, you know, the mystery of the moment.
Yeah.
And in the mystery of the moment, you know, the mystery of the moment is dangerous because you don't have all your talking points and you don't have all your, you know, but that's a space where beloved spirit can actually pour through and move people. And I think, you know, we're going to have to find a way to move people beyond just like, hey, we have all the right talking points. Right. Like, how could you not have elected a Democrat? We have all the right talking, you know, like this kind of thing. And I'm with you. I don't self-identify as a Democrat. Yeah, but it's got to be beyond having all the right talking points. Absolutely. There has to be spirit there.
Yeah, absolutely. And ordinary folks have a good bullshit meter.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because the bullshit meters are different for, it's like, I think that, well, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Ordinary folks have a good bullshit meter. Yeah. And, the detachment of, you know, it's one of the challenges that social movements in America have faced for a long time. But in order for it to galvanize or to move, it can't feel like it's coming from a lofty tower, or it can't feel like it's coming from a, you know, I mean, there's like it's gotten overblown, but there's a reason why, you know, there's such conversation about like, oh, this is the party of elites and it's all coming from, you know, and yes, it's used by the other side and magnified way beyond what it is, but there's a grain of truth there too, which is that, you know, if it doesn't resonate, if it doesn't move with spirit, then it's not going to galvanize.
That's right. That's right. I'm very fascinated by curiosity as a spiritual virtue. And I'm curious whether in today's America, there's room for someone like a Congressman John Lewis to rise from the place of having loved and served people and having a kind of moral standing and credibility to have his policies taken seriously because his standing in the community had paid the price for it already. I'm curious. I'm curious whether is there still that much heart left in America to see a generation of people like that rise up, or are we too screwed? And I don't know. I'm curious.
Right. Or has it been, has the discourse become so mediated that, you know, it's really about who has the best short form video, or like, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, I tend to be a believer in the power of love and the power of spirit, you know, and I think that like Obama harnessed something. And then I think a lot of people were dissatisfied with him because he harnessed something, but then what he implemented, you know, wasn't necessarily brimming with spirit in the same way that his pre-election speeches were, right? And like, I believe in the ability of spirit to move people. So I think that something genuine really does take hold and it does take off, you know. Now, how does it sustain itself in the world that we're living in today? Who knows?
Yeah.
And it may be that it sustains itself mostly locally, which, we live at a time where we have this this thing called, choice and, the ability to vote. But what have people done in times of monarchies and tyrannies and this type of thing?
Exactly.
People have had no choice but to have their love manifest on the local level. And when you're talking about a world run by multi-billionaires, we may be able to somehow one day topple or modify or change, but we may also have to spend a whole lot of attention just in our immediate vicinity, because that may be the primary lever that we have. So we've, gone from the beautiful terminology of the beloved to an in-depth analysis of the Democratic Party's failings. But this is actually some of the stuff I wanted to get at a little bit, because I'm going to talk about in this episode the need for spirit and a rekindling of spirit.
Absolutely. I look forward to listening to it when it comes out.
Süleyman kuş gibi bir dediler. Süleyman kuş bilir dediler. Süleyman